It started not with a scandal, not with a televised interview, but with a whisper, one that ran cold through the centuries-old halls of Buckingham Palace. A whisper passed between two siblings, not just brother and sister, but monarch and royal stalwart, who had long endured a lifetime of headlines, heartbreak, and hollow smiles. Princess Anne and King Charles sat in a quiet room away from the golden trappings of the crown, and for the first time since Queen Elizabeth II's passing, they broke the code of royal silence. It was a confession not offered to the public out of anger or retribution. No, this was born out of necessity, a desperate attempt to reclaim truth after years of calculated manipulation, fractured loyalty, and a growing storm building behind closed doors. The catalyst? Their once beloved family member, Prince Harry. A man now oceans away, but whose shadow loomed large across every press briefing, every public event, every teary-eyed tribute to their late mother and grandmother. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What could possibly drive a king and his closest ally, a woman known for her quiet resolve and resistance to drama, to speak publicly and candidly about one of the most painful chapters in modern royal history? Because this time, it wasn't about gossip. It wasn't about drama. It was about blackmail. Prince Harry, according to sources confirmed in legal circles and whispers from the palace itself, had threatened to expose explosive secrets about Queen Elizabeth's final days, private royal medical records, and what he called the truth behind decades of family dysfunction. And in return for his silence, he allegedly demanded millions. Not a contract, not a donation, not a mediated deal. A flat-out payoff. Now ask yourself, if your child or your sibling demanded a price to keep quiet about your mother's deathbed, what would you do? The truth, or at least the royal family's truth, would not remain buried for long. And as of 2 minutes ago, the unthinkable happened. Princess Anne and King Charles broke rank and made a joint decision that stunned even their closest advisors. They confirmed what many suspected, but what no one wanted to say out loud. Prince Harry didn't just turn his back on the crown, he leveraged it, weaponized it, used it as bargaining power. But to understand how this came to be, you have to go back, long before Meghan, before Megxit, even before the press wars. You have to go back to the seeds of pain planted in Harry's early years, through the traumatic loss of his mother, through a life spent under glass. You have to trace how that boy, who once clutched his brother's hand behind Princess Diana's casket, slowly became a man capable of turning against the very institution that raised him. And while the media has painted him as either victim or villain, depending on the day, this isn't about casting Harry in one light. This is about what happens when grief, entitlement, and power collide behind the world's most gilded doors. Because as King Charles and Princess Anne would finally admit in their statement, a rare act of public unity from two of the most private royals, there were things said by Harry, things done in private meetings and encrypted messages, that forced them to take action not just as family, but as defenders of the monarchy. And the line was drawn over one word: silence. Harry's message to the palace, according to senior aides and legal insiders, was chillingly clear. He was prepared to release intimate details, not speculation, but real, damaging material, if his terms were not met. And those terms were centered around a financial settlement that would have quietly exchanged secrets for peace. But what could be so dark, so damaging, that the palace considered a private payout before rejecting it outright? At the heart of it was Queen Elizabeth's final days, her condition, her will, and the decisions made during her last moments at Balmoral. There are things, palace insiders say, that the public never knew. Disputes over access, arguments about who was notified, who was allowed to say goodbye, and who wasn't. And in that gray area, that space between tragedy and royal protocol, Prince Harry found leverage. And that's where the story truly begins. Because in every great downfall, there is always a trigger, a moment where what was whispered in corridors becomes something undeniable. For the monarchy, that moment came when Harry allegedly sent a representative to the palace, not just for reconciliation, but negotiation. And the message delivered wasn't just shocking, it was a threat. A modern, digital age equivalent of pay up or I speak. That's why King Charles, a man who spent his entire life preparing to lead with dignity, and princess, and the no-nonsense royal who once said, "When you meet resistance, push harder," decided enough was enough. This was no longer just a family matter. This was war, not of swords and armies, but of reputations and revelations. A war being fought with NDAs, legal drafts, and controlled leaks. But what happens when the institution that thrives on secrecy decides to speak? Their decision to finally address the rumors wasn't impulsive. It was strategic. It came after months of internal debate, legal scrutiny, and a series of escalating events that forced the royal siblings to put protocol aside. They chose transparency over tradition. Because silence, in this case, was no longer protection, it was permission. The full extent of Harry's alleged blackmail attempt is still being unpacked, but early indications suggest it involved more than just personal grievances. It touched on the Crown's finances, security details, and deeply personal family interactions that had never before seen the light of day. Emails, recordings, and references to things only a close royal would know. Some say it was desperation. Others believe it was revenge. But the facts remain. Demands were made. Silence was offered. And the palace refused. And that refusal, according to sources close to Charles, came with consequences. Harry was reportedly warned, not once, but multiple times, that pursuing this course of action would mean complete severance from royal privilege, that any cooperation, any future dialogue, would end the moment he used their grief as a bargaining chip. So here we are, a king facing his first major personal scandal since his coronation. A sister standing by him, as she always has, not with dramatic tears or theatrical interviews, but with a quiet steel that says, "We will not be threatened." And a former prince, thousands of miles away, accused of trying to profit from the pain of the people who raised him. As you'll soon see, the road to this moment was paved with red carpets and sealed letters, with silent dinners and teary phone calls, with moments that shattered trust, not with loud arguments, but with quiet, deliberate choices. And while the full truth may never be released in an official press briefing, enough has now come to light that we must ask the uncomfortable questions. Did Prince Harry cross a line from wounded son to calculated extortionist? Did the palace mishandle the growing fracture by ignoring the deeper emotional wounds? And most haunting of all, what did Queen Elizabeth know, and what did she leave behind to protect the institution she gave her life to? In this video, we're going to unpack the shocking timeline, the secret exchanges, and the emotional fallout that followed. We will examine what Harry demanded, how the royal family responded, and why Charles and Anne's decision to speak may have permanently altered the monarchy's future. Because the truth behind the whisper, the one that shattered Buckingham's silence, is louder than ever before. The story of Prince Harry's descent from beloved royal to alleged blackmailer didn't begin with a tabloid headline or a whispered rumor. It began in the quiet shadows of a golden childhood, one painted with pomp and privilege, yes, but also marked by isolation, expectation, and unspeakable grief. To understand how a boy who once stood solemnly beside his brother at their mother's funeral could later be accused of leveraging the family's pain for financial gain, we must go back. Not just to the days of Diana, but to the deep, unspoken rift that had been growing between Harry and the very institution into which he was born. It was never meant to be this way. Harry was the spare, the one who could smile freely, stumble occasionally, and live in the protective shadow of the heir. From a young age, he brought a certain wild charm to royal life that his more serious brother, William, never could. But that charm, that spark, came at a cost. Because from the moment he could walk, Harry was under scrutiny. Every misstep, every expression, every deviation from the scripted royal protocol was magnified. And the press, the ever-watchful, often cruel British media, seemed determined to define him before he had a chance to define himself. Still, there was a time when he loved it. Or, at least, when he tolerated it. He was the cheeky schoolboy who stuck his tongue out at photographers. The young man who served bravely in Afghanistan. The prince who laughed loudly at polo matches and hugged children with a warmth that the public adored. But behind that easy grin, Harry was battling demons that few understood, and even fewer acknowledged. Much of this stemmed from the loss of his mother, Princess Diana, a woman whose death didn't just break the hearts of a nation, but shattered the emotional safety of two young boys. Harry was only 12 when he was forced to walk behind her coffin in front of the world, a moment that, by his own admission, he never truly recovered from. And while William seemed to channel his grief into quiet stoicism and responsibility, Harry began to unravel. The first signs were subtle. Rebellious behavior at school, parties that made headlines, a string of short-lived relationships and controversial statements. But what the public saw as a wild phase was, in truth, a cry for help. A young man lost in the vast machinery of monarchy, unsure of who he was without the woman who had once protected him from its coldness. Princess Anne saw this. Always observant, often silent, she had grown up watching her brothers be molded by the institution. Charles into duty, Andrew into indulgence, Edward into quiet compliance. But Harry was different. He wore his heart on his sleeve. And even though Anne rarely spoke publicly about the internal affairs of the family, insiders say she voiced her concern early on. He needs purpose, she allegedly said in private. And if he doesn't find it within these walls, he'll look elsewhere. For a time, that purpose was found in service. His 2 tours in Afghanistan weren't just military assignments. They were a lifeline. There, Harry wasn't a prince. He was just a soldier. And for once, the expectations and cameras melted away. He was respected for his courage, admired for his loyalty, and, crucially, not defined by his title. But even that sanctuary didn't last. Once his presence on the front lines became public, he was pulled back. For his safety, they said. For the crown's reputation. And with that, the slow disillusionment began. What followed was a tug-of-war between identity and image. Harry wanted more than ceremonial duties. He wanted a real voice, real impact. But within the royal system, roles are inherited, not invented. And while William was groomed for kingship, Harry was often relegated to second place. Second priority. Second thought. It was during this period that the fractures began to show. Behind closed doors, there were arguments. Not the loud, dramatic kind, but the slow, festering kind. The kind where disappointment turns to resentment. Harry reportedly began to question decisions, challenge protocols, and express frustration with being silenced. He didn't want to wave from balconies and unveil plaques. He wanted to create something of his own. And then came Meghan. Her arrival was the match to a long-fused powder keg. To Harry, Meghan represented freedom. A woman from outside the system. Independent, outspoken, and completely untouched by the rigid expectations of royal tradition. But to the monarchy, she was a disruption, not because of her background or her race, but because of what she symbolized: change, unpredictability, a voice that wouldn't stay within the lines. Charles, by then Prince of Wales, tried to be supportive, at least publicly. He walked Meghan down the aisle when her own father didn't show up. He praised the couple's energy and spoke of a new chapter for the family. But privately, things were different. The tension between William and Harry was becoming unmanageable. Meetings turned cold, briefings became strategic, and the cracks became too large to hide. Princess Anne, ever the realist, allegedly warned the family not to underestimate what could happen if Harry felt cornered. She understood, better than most, what it meant to be underestimated by the institution. As a woman born into royalty, she had to fight tooth and nail to carve out her own path, not through drama, but through relentless work and loyalty. But Harry didn't want quiet compliance. He wanted a break. And soon, he would take one. The announcement that Harry and Meghan would step back from royal duties sent shockwaves across the globe. It wasn't just the act, it was the way they did it. Public, sudden, and without full royal consent. For the monarchy, this was betrayal. For Harry, it was liberation. Or so it seemed. Because even as they settled into their new lives in North America, even as they launched podcasts, documentaries, and business deals, the rift didn't heal. It deepened. And soon, Harry wasn't just stepping back, he was speaking out. Explosive interviews, emotional confessions, claims of racism, neglect, and systemic cruelty. Whether you believed him or not, one thing was clear: Harry was no longer holding back. And every time he spoke, the palace bled. And, who had once tried to warn the family, now stood quietly beside her brother, Charles, watching as their family's private pain became Netflix's next big headline. But there was one thing she didn't expect: that it would go beyond words, that it would turn into demands, that Harry would allegedly cross the final line. And that's where we now stand. At the edge of a scandal that threatens to redefine how the public sees not just Harry, but the monarchy itself. Because for all the stories that have come before, the Diana tapes, the Camilla backlash, the Andrew fallout, none have involved an accusation this severe, that a member of the royal family demanded a financial settlement to remain silent about the final days of a reigning monarch. This chapter, then, is not just about estrangement. It's about transformation. It is about a boy who once kissed his mother's cheek before her final car ride becoming a man willing to barter royal secrets. It is about a crown that once seemed invincible, now forced to defend itself from one of its own. It is about trust broken, bridges burned, and a legacy hanging in the balance. And as we peel back the layers of what truly happened, what was said, what was threatened, and what was demanded, we must ask the hardest question of all. Was this the inevitable result of years of emotional neglect? Or was it a calculated act cloaked in the language of pain? Because the royal rift, decades in the making, has now reached its most dangerous point. And the next move, made not by Harry, but by Charles and Anne, may determine whether the monarchy survives the fallout intact or finally begins to crumble. Before the world knew of any blackmail, before Harry's alleged threats ever echoed behind palace walls, there was a silence, deliberate, painful, and calculated, surrounding the final months of Queen Elizabeth II's life. It was a silence maintained not out of fear, but out of loyalty, to her country, to her family, and perhaps most heartbreakingly, to the institution she had served for more than 70 years. Queen Elizabeth was a woman born into a legacy she never sought, a second daughter, never expected to rule, but destined to carry the weight of an empire. From the moment she ascended the throne, she was taught to remain calm in chaos, silent in scandal, and distant when personal pain threatened to overshadow public duty. She had endured wars, assassinations, divorces, and disgrace. But nothing tested her restraint more than the final chapters of her reign, when her own grandson, once considered her favorite, began pulling at the seams of the very monarchy she had spent a lifetime protecting. There were whispers in the palace long before any official announcement. Staff noticed it first. Subtle shifts in her routine, her energy, her schedule. The Queen, once known for her unwavering stamina, began canceling appearances. Meetings were postponed, then reassigned. There were murmurs of discomfort, fatigue, and more frequent visits from royal physicians. And yet, no word was spoken publicly. Not about her condition, not about her prognosis, not even to all her grandchildren. According to senior aides, the Queen made a choice. A conscious decision to tell only a handful of people the truth about her health. King Charles, then still the Prince of Wales, was of course informed. So was Princess Anne, her only daughter and most consistent confidant. But Harry? The situation was more complicated. Reports suggest that Queen Elizabeth was conflicted. On one hand, she loved Harry deeply. He reminded her of her own father, kind, spontaneous, full of heart. On the other hand, his behavior in recent years had left her bruised in a way few could understand. The Oprah interview. The veiled accusations. The notion that she, the sovereign matriarch, had been complicit in his suffering. It cut deeply. And so, when it came time to share the seriousness of her illness, the Queen allegedly made a quiet pact with those closest to her. The news would not be disseminated widely. It would not be part of press briefings or family emails. It would remain sacred, protected from leaks, speculation, and worse, manipulation. This silent pact, as it came to be known among staff, was honored to the letter by Princess Anne, known for her discipline and discretion, and became the Queen's unofficial shield. She visited Balmoral frequently, not just as a daughter, but as a gatekeeper. It was, and who coordinated private family visits, managed sensitive correspondence, and ensured that only those truly trusted were allowed near the Queen during her increasingly fragile moments. It wasn't about excluding Harry, some insist. It was about protecting Elizabeth from more heartbreak. Still, as the Queen's health deteriorated, the clock began ticking, not just on her life, but on the fragile balance within the royal family. Behind palace doors, conversations grew more urgent. Charles and Anne, sometimes joined by key senior staff, began preparing for the inevitable. But it wasn't just funeral logistics or coronation planning that concerned them. It was what would happen when Harry found out. and more importantly, how he would react to not being fully informed. Sources say there were concerns that any early communication with Harry might end up in the media, that a single detail, even unintentionally leaked, could spark a tabloid frenzy and throw the royal household into further chaos during a critical moment. And so, the silence continued. But silence, no matter how well-intentioned, has consequences. Harry, reportedly unaware of the full extent of his grandmother's condition, continued with public appearances and projects overseas. There were rumors of strained phone calls, attempts at reconciliation that were either ignored or intercepted. Meghan allegedly urged him to reach out directly, to bypass the palace machinery, but Harry, perhaps still trying to respect protocol, hesitated. Then came the final days. When the announcement came that Queen Elizabeth had been placed under medical supervision at Balmoral, it sent shockwaves through the global media. But within the family, the shock was different. It wasn't just about her health, it was about timing. Harry, who had been in the UK for an unrelated charity event, rushed to Balmoral. But by the time he arrived, the Queen was gone. Official statements were vague. The media focused on the symbolism of the family gathering at her bedside. But privately, Harry was devastated. And, according to palace sources, furious. It was in the days following her death that the first signs of trouble emerged. Harry reportedly confronted senior staff, asking why he hadn't been informed sooner, why he hadn't been given the chance to say goodbye properly. The responses he received were measured, diplomatic, but behind the scenes, the tension was palpable. Princess Anne, who had been by her mother's side in the final hours, was said to be deeply affected by Harry's reaction. She reportedly viewed his anger as misplaced, especially given the choices he had made in the years leading up to that moment. To her, his absence wasn't a matter of logistics. It was the natural consequence of distance, both physical and emotional, that he himself had initiated. Yet Harry didn't see it that way. What happened next remains one of the most guarded mysteries in recent royal history. Some claim that Harry began requesting access to private documents, correspondence, medical logs, and even elements of the Queen's final will. Others believe he simply wanted answers, but was met with silence. Either way, it became clear that there was a widening chasm between what Harry believed he was entitled to and what the palace was willing to provide. This growing tension led to what many now describe as the beginning of the end, a series of private demands, communications through intermediaries, veiled threats of exposure, and then the bombshell, an alleged request for financial compensation, a settlement in exchange for discretion. The silent pact, once meant to protect the Queen's dignity, had now become a point of leverage. To Charles and Anne, this was betrayal in its purest form. They had honored the Queen's wishes to the very end. They had maintained silence out of respect, out of duty. And now, that silence was being weaponized against them. The question then became, what exactly did Harry know? Some believe he had access to personal letters written by the Queen during her illness, letters that spoke candidly of her fears, her regrets, and her hopes for the future of the monarchy. Others think he possessed recordings, intimate family conversations captured on encrypted devices or voice notes. None of this has been confirmed, but the mere possibility was enough to send the palace into crisis mode. And here lies the tragedy. Queen Elizabeth, a woman who ruled with grace and restraint, whose greatest strength was her ability to endure, never imagined that her passing would be the spark for a firestorm. She believed in the power of silence, of quiet resolve in the face of chaos. But in today's world, silence is no longer sacred. It is currency, and Harry, willingly or not, became its broker. Princess Anne, more than anyone, felt the weight of that betrayal. She had stood by her mother's side, ensured her wishes were carried out, protected her dignity in death just as she had in life. And now, she found herself accused, not directly, but implicitly, of denying Harry a final moment of closure. A cruel irony, given how tirelessly she had worked to preserve the sanctity of that moment. As Charles prepared for his coronation and resumed her public duties, the palace was quietly locked in legal discussions. They knew that whatever came next, be it leaks, memoirs, or lawsuits, would not just affect their legacy, but the Queen's. Because at the heart of it all was a woman who had given everything for her family and country. And in her final moments, she asked for only one thing: peace. That peace, tragically, was never granted. And so, the silent pact, born of love, preserved by duty, became the very thing that ignited the most explosive confrontation in royal history. As we now turn to the next chapter, we'll explore the moment Harry stepped away from duty and how that decision, celebrated by some, condemned by others, led directly to the events we now see unraveling in the glare of global scrutiny. What did he hope to gain? What was he truly willing to sacrifice? When the announcement came on January 8, 2020, it wasn't delivered through the palace. It didn't arrive via official royal correspondence or a carefully worded press release agreed upon by the monarchy. No, it was posted on Instagram. In a split-second decision that would alter royal history, Prince Harry and Meghan Markle shared a joint statement declaring their intention to step back as senior members of the royal family. The post was short, crisp, and shockingly public. They wanted to be financially independent. They wanted to split their time between North America and the United Kingdom. They wanted a new life. But behind the calm wording of that message, there was something else, something sharper. A veiled ultimatum, a move not made in coordination with the palace, but in defiance of it. For many inside the royal household, that post wasn't a resignation. It was a declaration of war. To the public, the news was dizzying. How could two of the most high-profile members of the royal family, so recently celebrated in a glamorous wedding funded in part by the taxpayers, walk away from their duties without warning? Why now? What had driven them to such a drastic decision? The answer, according to sources within the palace and those who observed the private rift growing, is that the Sussex exit was never just about freedom. It was about power. It was about control. And it was about fear. The fear that their voices would continue to be stifled, their narratives distorted, and their place in the institution forever relegated to second class. For Harry, this was a slow-burning fuse that had been lit years prior. As the spare, he had long struggled to find purpose beyond supporting the heir. And while his early years in the military offered structure and meaning, his return to royal life after his tours in Afghanistan left him directionless. Ceremonial ribbon cuttings and state dinners felt hollow. He yearned for something more. When Meghan came into the picture, she offered just that. A path forward, a new identity, and most importantly, a partner who saw the royal system not as a venerable tradition to be revered, but as a confining machine built on hierarchy, deference, and silence. Meghan's arrival did more than shake up protocol. It gave Harry a new language for his discontent. It gave his long-simmering frustration a focus. In their whirlwind courtship, there were already signs of friction. Senior aides noticed Harry growing increasingly protective, defensive even, as criticism of Meghan began to creep into media coverage. There were arguments behind closed doors about press access, photo calls, and royal scheduling. But it wasn't until after their wedding that the real fracture began to form. According to insider reports, the couple felt sidelined from the start. Their residence at Frogmore Cottage, a beautiful but distinctly separate property, symbolized more than just geographic distance. It represented their isolation. They were briefed less frequently, consulted less often, and when Meghan attempted to bring a more American-style public relations approach to their engagements, she was met with resistance. There were disagreements over staff, tensions over travel, rumors of shouting matches between aides and claims that Meghan was difficult, demanding, even bullying, claims she has strongly denied. The palace, ever discreet, refused to comment. But the damage was done. The press sensed blood, and in the months that followed, the headlines grew darker. Then came the lawsuits. Harry, in a move that stunned royal watchers, filed legal action against several tabloid newspapers for phone hacking and defamation. Meghan followed suit over a private letter published by the Mail on Sunday. This wasn't unprecedented. The royal family had taken legal steps in the past, but it was the tone that was different. The Sussexes weren't playing defense. They were attacking, and with every new headline, the palace grew more anxious. Behind the scenes, meetings were held. Advisors debated strategies. The Queen, deeply concerned about the emotional well-being of her grandson, reportedly requested private conversations. But Harry and Meghan, feeling increasingly cornered, had already begun making plans. By the time the Instagram post went live, the decision was made. They were out, and they weren't waiting for permission. To Charles and Anne, The move felt like betrayal. Not because the couple wanted a different life, that could be understood, but because of the way it was done. Without notice, without coordination, without respect for the centuries-old institution that they and the Queen had devoted their lives to protecting. More critically, it opened a door that had never before been breached, the threat of independence tied to public exposure. In their statement, Harry and Meghan made it clear they would continue to support the Queen, but would seek to work to become financially independent. This, more than anything, sent shivers through the palace. What did financially independent mean for two people whose value was intrinsically tied to their royal status? What kinds of deals would they pursue? And what kind of secrets might they share, intentionally or not, in the process? For Charles, these weren't abstract questions. They were urgent. He reportedly held a series of emergency meetings with senior staff and legal counsel to assess the implications. Could the Sussexes legally use the royal brand in commercial ventures? Would they retain access to classified state briefings? Were there any binding agreements to prevent the disclosure of internal family matters? The answers were murky at best, and that uncertainty, according to those close to the king, was the true danger. And, for her part, was less emotional. She had long predicted something like this would happen. They want to rewrite the rules, she allegedly told a confidant. But the rules are what keep us intact. In the days and weeks following the announcement, public statements were cautious. The Queen expressed her support, but also made clear that discussions were ongoing. There was talk of a transition period, of trial separations and partial duties. But behind the scenes, the mood was less conciliatory. A quiet but unmistakable sense of threat had settled over the palace. The Sussexes, in asserting their independence, had effectively said, "Let us go, or we'll go our own way." And in a world where media deals, memoirs, and interviews could be monetized in the millions, the stakes were enormous. And then came the negotiations. Dubbed the Sandringham Summit by the press, the meeting between the Queen, Charles, William, and Harry was meant to find a path forward. Meghan, who had already returned to Canada, was reportedly involved via phone. But the tone was tense. According to sources, Charles was firm, William hurt, and, though not officially in the room, was briefed in real time. The outcome was what the public later learned as the Megxit Agreement, a 12-month review period. The couple would step back from royal duties, relinquish HRH titles, and repay the renovation costs of Frogmore Cottage. But the most controversial point remained largely unspoken. The question of information. Would Harry and Meghan talk? That question would hang over the monarchy for months. Because the truth was, even with titles stripped and security arrangements severed, the Sussexes still knew things. Personal details, financial arrangements, conversations never meant for public ears. And though no one could prove intent, the suspicion lingered that in the wrong hands, even a casual anecdote could be weaponized. In retrospect, many now believe the Sussex exit was more than a separation. It was a strategic maneuver, a power play, the beginning of a slow, deliberate campaign to reshape not only public opinion, but perhaps history itself. And while some viewed Harry and Meghan as brave truth-tellers reclaiming their autonomy, others saw them as renegades dismantling an institution they once vowed to serve. The divide was clear. But within the royal family, the consequences were only just beginning to unfold. What began as a bid for freedom was now being interpreted as a veiled threat, one that would culminate in demands, accusations, and ultimately, allegations of blackmail that would force King Charles and Princess to act not as family, but as guardians of the crown. And as we now turn to the next chapter, the infamous Oprah interview and the alleged legal scramble that followed, we must ask, did the Sussexes ever truly intend to leave quietly? Or was their exit always designed to serve as leverage? If the Sussex exit was a quiet revolution, the Oprah interview was a cannon blast across the bow of Buckingham Palace. It shattered any illusion that the parting had been amicable, unraveling decades of royal discretion with one carefully edited primetime special. Airing on March 7, 2021, it wasn't just a ratings hit. It was a cultural moment, a reckoning. And, for the royal family, a bombshell that landed with a deafening silence inside the palace walls. From the moment Oprah leaned forward and asked, "Were you silent, or were you silenced?" the tone was set. Meghan's response, delivered with dramatic poise and quiet rage, would reverberate far beyond the manicured garden where the interview took place. But what most viewers didn't see, and what few truly understood at the time, was how high the stakes were behind that moment. Because according to palace insiders, the family had been bracing for a public confrontation. What they didn't expect was how calculated and potentially litigious the fallout would become. Inside the palace, the days leading up to the interview had been tense. Senior advisors had received advance warning that a major broadcast was in the works. Initial rumors suggested it would be a soft, personal reflection, a look back at the couple's first year outside the royal institution. But as more details leaked, anxiety grew. Legal teams were quietly mobilized. Public relations experts were summoned. What if damaging claims were made? What if names were named? Behind the scenes, a special team was set up at Clarence House, reportedly at the direction of Prince Charles. Their mission was clear: monitor the interview in real time, flag any legally questionable content, and prepare rapid response communications for the press. Princess, and, though not directly involved in the legal preparation, was briefed personally by Charles on the possible flashpoints. Her reaction, according to aides, was one of steely resolve. "If he's going to go this far," she reportedly said of Harry, "then we go farther." And then the interview aired. From the outset, it was clear the gloves were off. Meghan spoke of being trapped, of not receiving help when experiencing suicidal thoughts. She alleged that the palace refused to provide mental health support, that royal officials denied Archie a title and security, and that there were concerns and conversations about how dark his skin might be when he's born. The last statement landed like a thunderclap. A suggestion that someone within the royal household had voiced concern over their unborn child's skin tone was, without question, explosive. Oprah's stunned silence said everything. And yet Meghan refused to name the individual. "That would be very damaging to them," she said cryptically. Within minutes, social media exploded. Newsrooms from London to Los Angeles scrambled to respond. Public figures took sides. Political leaders commented. Activists seized the moment. The monarchy, an institution designed to withstand the storms of centuries, found itself suddenly gasping for air in a world that demanded transparency, accountability, and instant reaction. Back in the UK, the palace went into crisis mode. Charles reportedly locked himself in his study that night, watching the interview unfold in disbelief. At several points, he stopped the broadcast to pace. When the claims of racism surfaced, he allegedly turned to one of his aides and said, "This is beyond dangerous." Not because of the accusation itself, but because of how vague it was. The implication cast a cloud over the entire royal family. Anyone could be suspected. Everyone would be implicated. And, who had long maintained a professional distance from the media frenzy, was said to be livid. To her, the suggestion that the family she had served with such dignity could be painted as covertly racist was not only untrue, it was unforgivable. According to one insider, she told a close advisor that night, "She knows exactly what she's doing." And so does he. But the interview wasn't finished. Harry soon joined the conversation, and with him came an entirely new set of grievances. He spoke of feeling trapped within the system, claimed his father had stopped taking his calls, and said his family had cut him off financially. Most notably, he claimed that no one in the royal family had publicly stood up to the press on behalf of Meghan, a woman he described as being driven to the brink. To the public, these were intimate revelations, raw, emotional, human. But inside the palace, they were seen as deliberate provocations. And worse, they contained what palace lawyers immediately flagged as potential falsehoods. Take the claim about finances. Harry insisted that his family literally cut him off in the first quarter of 2020. Yet publicly available financial disclosures from Clarence House showed that Charles continued to fund the Sussexes during that time, to the tune of several £1,000,000. Was this a lie, a misunderstanding, or a strategic narrative? Then there was the issue of titles. Meghan implied that Archie had been denied a princely title because of his mixed-race heritage. But royal protocols, dating back to George V.'s letters patent of 1917, dictate that great-grandchildren of the sovereign do not automatically receive princely status, unless they are children of the heir, which Archie was not at the time. These discrepancies were not lost on the palace. Within hours, the legal team assigned to the Oprah response had compiled a dossier of contested claims. Each was analyzed not just for accuracy, but for potential legal exposure. The Queen was briefed. Charles held meetings with his advisors and was consulted. And in what many now believe was a crucial decision, they chose to issue a single, carefully worded public statement. Recollections may vary. That was the phrase that turned heads, a subtle but unmistakable way of saying, "We dispute WA." But behind the curtain, they were preparing for something much darker. Because even as the media devoured the interview, even as public opinion fractured into pro- and anti-monarchy camps, the palace was gathering evidence. Documents, emails, communications that, if necessary, could be used to refute specific claims. Not because they wanted to, but because they feared what might come next. There were rumors, even then, of more content in the works. A book deal, a docuseries, memoirs, and the most troubling possibility of all, a coordinated effort to pressure the monarchy through public opinion, timed to coincide with behind-the-scenes demands. It was during this period that whispers of legal threats began to circulate. The palace, through intermediaries, had allegedly received word that Harry was prepared to release more private details, some involving Queen Elizabeth's final months, if certain conditions weren't met. The nature of those conditions remains classified, but insiders say they involved a mix of financial compensation, security guarantees, and access to archival records. Was it blackmail? Was it emotional coercion? Or was it, as some in Harry's camp might claim, a desperate attempt to defend his wife and child from an unfeeling system? Regardless of the motive, the palace took it seriously. Charles, for the first time, began considering the nuclear option, complete legal separation. The idea was simple, brutal, and unprecedented. Declare Harry a private citizen in full. Remove all remaining privileges, strip honorary titles, and issue legal notices to cease and desist from using royal branding. And supported the move. She believed the integrity of the crown was more important than any individual relationship. And to her, Harry had crossed a line, not by speaking out, but by doing so in a manner that threatened the entire institution. But the Queen, ever the peacemaker, urged caution. She still believed in reconciliation. She still hoped that this public firestorm might settle into private resolution. She would not live to see whether that hope bore fruit. As we now move into the next phase of this unraveling saga, the documents Harry allegedly possesses and the mounting suspicion that he may have used them as leverage, one thing becomes clear. The Oprah interview wasn't just an emotional release. It was a warning shot, and the monarchy, though silent on the surface, was already preparing for the storm that would follow. By the time the Oprah interview had circled the globe and dominated global headlines, the royal family's internal panic had reached a new level. It wasn't just about what had been said in that landscaped California garden. It was what hadn't been said. The implications, the subtext, the quiet threat behind every answer Harry and Meghan offered. And while public opinion teetered between sympathy and skepticism, one fact remained undeniable behind palace walls. Prince Harry was no longer playing by the royal rulebook. He was speaking a new language, one that combined trauma, truth, and leverage. And the most terrifying rumor spreading through the upper ranks of the monarchy was this. He had receipts. They called it, in hushed tones, the Montecito Files. Not an official title, not a known dossier with labels and folders, but a term whispered among aides, legal advisors, and palace insiders to refer to what Prince Harry was believed to have collected since his departure from royal life. According to multiple sources close to both the palace and the Sussex Circle, Harry possessed documents, potentially audio files, written communications, or even video recordings, that could bring the monarchy to its knees if made public. What were these files exactly? That was the question that plagued King Charles and Princess Anne the most. Because if the threats were real, and not just posturing, then the damage could be catastrophic. And worse, if those files related to Queen Elizabeth's final days, as some suspected, the fallout would not be limited to reputational harm. It could cast doubt on the internal operations of the crown during the sovereign's most vulnerable moments. It could raise legal questions about her care, her will, and even the succession process. Let's rewind to the source of these suspicions. It all started with a leak, subtle, almost imperceptible, but noticed immediately by the right people. A journalist with long-standing ties to the Sussexes casually mentioned in an offhand podcast appearance that Harry had documented everything during the breakdown of the royal relationship. It wasn't an official quote. It wasn't a scandal, but it was enough to trigger alarm bells in Whitehall and Clarence House. Did he record phone calls? Did he archive texts? Did Meghan, whose background in Hollywood made her acutely aware of how narratives are shaped, encourage him to keep a record of their dealings with the palace? Had they saved documents, internal letters, emails, confidential correspondences that painted the monarchy in a negative light? From that point forward, the palace operated under a new, unspoken assumption. Harry had something. Maybe a lot of things. One particularly troubling rumor involved a handwritten letter from Queen Elizabeth to Harry, allegedly written weeks before her death. The existence of such a letter was never officially confirmed, but several aides noticed a sudden shift in the Queen's private routine around that time. Her longtime assistant was seen delivering sealed envelopes. Meetings with family members were cancelled without reason. And most notably, Princess Anne's trips to Balmoral became more frequent and more urgent. If such a letter existed, and Harry had retained a copy, it could change everything. Because unlike anonymous sources or hearsay, a personal letter from the sovereign, voicing opinions, regrets, or instructions, would carry irreversible weight. Other sources claimed Harry had access to emails exchanged between Meghan and senior palace aides, particularly during the fraught period leading up to their exit. These emails allegedly documented requests for help, complaints about racism or discrimination, and refusals from the Crown's media teams to push back against hostile press stories. In the right context, such emails could frame the palace as neglectful, complicit, or worse, malicious. Then there was the issue of security. Harry and Meghan had long argued that removing their publicly funded security was both unsafe and unfair. But behind the scenes, reports suggested they had documentation showing how abruptly those protections were cut off, and who signed the orders. If those documents showed that decisions were made without due process or against advice from intelligence officials, the monarchy could face not only criticism, but lawsuits. Charles and Anne were briefed on all of this regularly. By this point, Princess Anne had moved from a position of guarded concern to one of aggressive preparation. She reportedly told a senior staffer during a private lunch, "We cannot wait for him to play his hand. We must assume it's already been dealt." And so, a counter-operation began. While the palace maintained its dignified silence in public, privately, it launched a quiet internal review. Advisors were tasked with combing through past correspondences between Harry and the royal household. Lawyers were consulted to determine what, if any, legal boundaries could be enforced regarding private documents. The palace's digital security teams worked overtime, reviewing access logs, email servers, and phone records to assess what Harry might have downloaded or retained before stepping back. The mood was tense. No one said the word blackmail out loud, but everyone was thinking it. Even those who had once advocated for a soft approach toward Harry and Meghan began shifting their stance. The idea that a royal, especially one of the Queen's grandchildren, would weaponize personal communications and potentially moments from her final days was more than just painful. It was existential. The monarchy operates on a very delicate balance of power and perception. Its survival depends not only on constitutional tradition, but on public trust. If that trust was eroded, if the public began to believe that the family had treated one of its own cruelly or covered up internal dysfunction, it could open the floodgates. And Harry seemed to know this. At a charity event in late 2021, months after the Oprah interview, but before the release of his memoir deal was announced, Harry gave a brief, off-script remark during a Q&A. When asked about his relationship with the royal family, he responded, "I've always said I'll tell my story one way or another. It's just a matter of timing." That sentence reverberated across British newsrooms. It wasn't just a declaration, it was a warning, a line drawn in sand. And many now believe it was a calculated signal to the palace, "Don't push me too far." Around the same time, Meghan appeared on the Ellen DeGeneres show, offering a far more playful and light-hearted version of their new life. But to those watching from inside the palace, the juxtaposition was jarring. It was as if they were building two narratives simultaneously, one rooted in victimhood and threat, the other in reinvention and optimism. And both, potentially backed by a cache of sensitive documents. That is the heart of what became known as the Montecito Files. Not a single folder, not a flash drive, but the idea that somewhere, in their California estate or a secured digital cloud, Harry held the crown's secrets. Not historical records or abstract musings, but real conversations, real letters, real evidence. And here's where the danger became immediate. According to a highly placed source within the royal legal team, an unofficial inquiry was made, discreetly, into whether any preventative legal measures could be taken. Could the palace sue in advance? Could it issue a preemptive injunction against the publication of certain materials? Could they demand to see the contents of any files Harry intended to share? The answers, unsurprisingly, were complicated. Harry was no longer a working royal. He resided in the United States. The British monarchy held no legal jurisdiction over his household abroad. Any attempt to forcibly retrieve or restrict documents could be construed as harassment. Worse, it could confirm the existence of those materials and give Harry the moral high ground. It would look like censorship, like cover-up. And so the palace remained stuck, forced to play defense, uncertain of where the next blow might land. But one person refused to remain idle. Princess Anne. Sources within her staff revealed that she took the growing crisis personally. To her, this wasn't just about protecting the institution. It was about defending her mother's legacy. She reportedly confided in her closest aide that she feared Harry was using grief as a currency. And she warned Charles that a line had to be drawn, publicly, firmly, and soon. That conversation, some say, was the turning point that led to the decision for Anne and Charles to break their silence, to stop tiptoeing around the issue, to speak, carefully but clearly, about what had been happening behind closed doors. But before that would happen, one final attempt at peace was made. A quiet message, delivered through a mutual acquaintance, was sent from the palace to Montecito. It asked for clarification, not threats, not negotiations, just clarity. What did Harry intend to do? What were his real terms? No response ever came. And from that moment on, Charles and Anne knew. The silence wasn't diplomacy. It was strategy, and it was time to prepare for war. It wasn't a single moment that broke King Charles. It was a slow corrosion, the kind that chips away at the walls of a man who had spent decades building the emotional resilience required to stand at the heart of one of the most scrutinized families in the world. For all the public composure, the royal walkabouts, the scripted speeches and forced smiles, Charles was still a father. And what tore him apart wasn't just betrayal. It was the realization that the child he had once held in his arms was now allegedly using the family's most private wounds as a weapon. But it was more than emotional anguish. It was legal, reputational, and, above all, existential. Because by the time whispers of blackmail had fully reached the palace, Charles was no longer Prince of Wales. He was king, the monarch, the figurehead of a constitutional institution that survived not on brute force, but on trust. And when that trust is threatened from within, silence becomes complicity. For months after the Montecito Files became the subject of high-level concern, Charles had held back. Cautious, reflective, and at times even hopeful, he clung to the belief that Harry could still be reasoned with. That beneath the bitterness and media narratives, there was still a thread of familial connection that could be salvaged. He held private meetings with advisors, sent messages through intermediaries, and even suggested a quiet meeting on neutral ground, away from cameras, lawyers, and expectations. Harry never accepted. As the king, Charles was surrounded by a team of seasoned professionals, constitutional experts, private secretaries, legal counsels. But none of them could offer a blueprint for this. No reigning monarch in modern British history had faced an open, escalating threat from a close family member on this scale. Abdication was one thing. Divorce, scandal, even criminal accusations had plagued past royals. But blackmail? From within? The tension reached its peak in early 2023. It was just months before the king's formal coronation. A moment meant to symbolize unity, heritage, and national pride. But instead, it was clouded by uncertainty. Would Harry attend? Would he bring Meghan? Would they release another statement, another interview, another book? Every plan was made with contingency measures. Every detail examined for potential sabotage. But the breaking point came quietly, in a single, private meeting held at Windsor. The meeting, confirmed by two independent sources close to the royal household, involved Charles, Princess Anne, the Lord Chamberlain, and two senior legal advisors. It was a closed-door session. No aides, no press, no leaks, just a monarch, his sister, and his crisis team. By this point, Charles had received summaries of what Harry was rumored to possess, documents related to security arrangements, emails that painted the palace as neglectful or vindictive, private messages from the Queen herself. None of it was confirmed, but the mere possibility of it all being real, and worse, being published or used as bargaining chips, was enough. The discussion that followed was sobering, and, never one for emotional dramatics, laid it out plainly. "This cannot continue," she reportedly said. "He is not acting as family. He is acting as a liability." Charles, visibly shaken but resolute, nodded. According to those briefed on the meeting, the decision was made. If Harry proceeded with any further actions, be it blackmail, publication of private material, or public attacks tied to privileged royal information, the palace would respond with legal force. Not just civil litigation, but full severance. What that meant, in practical terms, was devastating. A legal declaration could be drafted to redefine Harry's status under British law. He would be officially classified as a private citizen with no royal affiliation. Any residual privileges, titles, ceremonial rights, honorary roles, would be stripped. The king would no longer recognize him as a functioning or symbolic member of the royal family. This was not a threat made lightly. Charles was acutely aware of the symbolism. To sever ties publicly with his son would send a message to the world and to history. But more importantly, it would draw a red line. A message to Harry, and to anyone else thinking of weaponizing their proximity to the crown. There are limits. It was, and who pushed the final piece of the plan. She insisted that Charles issue a subtle but firm message, a public-facing signal that the monarchy would no longer be held hostage to narratives or veiled threats. Not an attack, not an expose, but a measured statement that reasserted royal integrity and established the palace's right to defend itself. That signal would come weeks later in a speech Charles delivered during a state banquet at Windsor Castle. On the surface, it was an address about heritage, duty, and national unity. But one paragraph, carefully constructed by his speechwriters under and supervision, stood out. "There comes a time when even the most patient among us must draw a line, not to close a door, but to protect those on the other side of it. Tradition is not tyranny. It is memory. And to honor memory, we must sometimes endure painful choices." Those words were not lost on anyone. Within hours, commentators speculated about the speech's subtext. Some saw it as a dig at modern critics of the monarchy. But those in the know understood it was directed at one person, Harry. And in Montecito, the response was swift. Though Harry said nothing publicly, sources close to his circle revealed he was deeply hurt by the implication. But the truth was, the battle lines had already been drawn. Behind closed doors, Charles authorized his legal team to draft what would later be referred to as a contingency declaration. It outlined the steps required to remove remaining royal associations from Harry's identity. This included the possible revocation of his place in the line of succession, a move that would require parliamentary involvement but was legally possible under certain conditions. It also proposed banning the commercial use of any royal-affiliated titles, insignias, or properties in future Sussex projects. The declaration was never enacted, but it existed, a final card, ready to be played if Harry crossed a legal or ethical threshold the palace could no longer tolerate. Charles had drawn the line. Emotionally, it was shattering. Insiders say that following the Windsor meeting, the king spent the evening alone in the Queen's old drawing room, surrounded by her portraits and private journals. He read passages from her handwritten letters, notes filled with warmth, faith, and subtle worry about her grandson's future. To those who knew him well, it was the image of a father grieving in real time, not for a dead child, but for a living one he could no longer reach. And, for all her stoicism, was not immune to the weight of the moment either. She reportedly left the meeting and took a long walk through the Windsor grounds. A witness described her as looking angrier than ever, but also infinitely sad. The bond between Charles and had always been unbreakable. Raised in the same royal fishbowl, shaped by the same silences, They understood each other in ways no one else could. And in this moment of crisis, that bond had become the monarchy's final defense. Because while the king still longed for reconciliation and had already accepted what few dared to say out loud, the Harry they once knew no longer existed. What remained was a man driven by a sense of injury, emboldened by a world that rewarded outrage, and potentially armed with secrets that could devastate the legacy of their mother. And so, with quiet finality, Charles took the step he had hoped to avoid. He no longer waited for Harry's next move. He made one of his own. The palace's internal security was bolstered. Legal protocols were put in place, and a private intel. But the crown was now officially on the defensive. The message to Harry was clear: this is your final warning. As we move forward to the next chapter, we'll explore how Princess, and often overlooked in public royal dramas, became the monarchy's silent enforcer, the one who not only defended her brother, but took a personal stand against what she saw as the greatest betrayal of their generation.